Welcome to Access and Privacy Online, the podcast where we delve into the latest issues, challenges, and advancements in access to information and privacy rights. Today, we are looking beyond the usual question of how quickly government answers a Freedom of Information request. FIPA's Final Access Assessments report, Drawing Access Together, asks whether public bodies can find the right records, apply the law correctly, and preserve the information needed for accountable government. I'm Patrick Farnsworth. Joining me are report author Spencer Izen, FIPA Executive Director Jason Woywada, and FIPA President Mike Larsen. Let's dive in. Well, I'm glad we're all here together. It's been a while. Spencer, first, just want to really congratulate you for such a huge project. You completed it. You said it was something almost like 4 years in the making. So congratulations, truly. You pulled it off.
Thank you very much. It was many years of my life that went into it. I'm very happy I went into it, and I've made a lot of lovely friends along the way, and some fantastic mentors as well that got it to this point. So very much a team effort, even though I was the lead researcher on it.
Yeah, it's about the journey, not the destination, but you are at the destination, thankfully, seemingly. Yeah. Well, Spencer, thanks for coming back on. We have talked about this report over the past a couple of years or something since we started this podcast, it seems like. So it's really great that we're at this point in it. So Spencer, the first question we're going to start us off with is, for the listeners who have never filed a Freedom of Information request or maybe have never needed to, what was FIPA trying to understand through access assessments? And why did you decide to use FOI to study FOI?
Right. Well, I think the original idea to use FOI to study FOI came from Jason when I had spent a summer with FIPA in 2022 after I graduated high school. As a research assistant, supporting with a few projects, largely a news monitoring project. But I'd been a journalist effectively for 2 years at that point, so I was familiar with FOI. I'd cared about it. I had followed the introduction of Bill 21 or Bill 22 in 2021 that introduced a $10 fee for general freedom of information requests in BC. So I was familiar with the politics of FOI, and I think to sum up our original conversations between Jason and I in late 2022. Both of us were not satisfied with the way that we popularly understood FOI through metrics alone. Timeliness was not the only thing that we cared about. As applicants, as advocates, there was essentially more to the FOI story than just how long it was taking for a request to be processed, or how many pages were involved in a particular request. Those knowing this is important, but it's not going to get us across the finish line to understand what's bad about a $10 fee, what that's going to do to the applicant experience, whether or not we should reasonably expect it to make FOI faster, as the government told us 5 years ago now. So this project was born out of a mutual desire between Jason and myself to figure out a different way of understanding how freedom of information was administered and how we could actually understand that. From there, we spent a year poking around, trying to figure out what kinds of documents exist. This was, I think, largely to my benefit as someone who had never worked in a large organization before. FIPA, I mean, my newspaper that I work at still has a lot of volunteers, about 100, but I've never worked in something the size of the BC Public Service before. So the variety of literature that you might encounter there was entirely unknown to me, and pretty much the best insight I had into it was a British television show called Yes Minister from the 80s, which is both out of consonance and out of date for what we do. So, but after that, then I drilled down and had become, through my schooling at UBC, a real student of science and technology studies, developed a real interest in documentation. I think the book I would credit to that, it's somewhere on my desk actually. The first book that got me really thinking about documents, because this whole is Information and Society by Michael Buckland. It's part of the MIT MIT Essential Knowledge series. It's like I reread it again recently, and I for another reason, and I forgot just how much of the study was actually driven by like a desire to like think about what is significant about a document, not only as an object that we can treat as a unit of data, like I was doing for my study, but also as something that's politically significant. Like ultimately, the purpose of freedom of information is to transfer a document from one person to another, and we hope that that exchange of information is going to result in something democratically desirable. So that's essentially where the study came from. Is we didn't think that numbers alone could tell us enough. So we wanted to look under the hood and figure out how freedom of information actually works. And this study is what we ended up with.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, what can we understand about the internal policies, the procedures, the training materials? I mean, what can they tell us about how an access system works that annual statistics cannot?
Right. I mean, in this sense, this was the most agonizing question of my methodological journey. For this isn't really the type of research that I realized early on. You're going to find a lot of people doing. You'll find a lot of historians. I realized very late in the game, who obviously exclusively know the past through documents. Even then, they're working with a fair amount of dialogical texts. You've got correspondence, you've got letters. People are being very candid about differences of opinion. But working with monological texts, texts that aren't really speaking to a particular person, like a manual, like a policy, like a guideline, those are not subject to the same degree of systematic, interpretive, or scientific research that most documentation is. So that was the first challenge, is actually finding a way to actually answer that question: is what can we tell about a document? I wasn't satisfied by like more discursive approaches that would argue these documents are like a reflection of priorities, or they can reveal something deep down about like the essence or of the public service. There is a large school of research about that. I didn't think it worked for this because if we were, I would, because of my training in technically the program is called informatics, but what I didn't want to do is to make a bunch of claims as a new researcher, as with a kind of novel method that were perhaps reading into things too much. And it was like I remember going reading a lot of early studies and articles and a few methods textbooks that would encourage researchers to look for absences. And I got kind of disheartened by that at a certain point, because on one hand, it was very easy to be like, okay, yes, I can see what's absent. And that's very easy when you're just reading that book to kind of intuitively say to yourself, oh yeah, okay, I look for things that are present and that are absent. The things that are absent indicate what's a priority and what's not. Easy. Then you look at the document and you say to yourself, I have no idea what I'm looking at. I'm looking at deeply decontextualized bureaucratic literature in the form of potentially thousands of pages in one PDF. I have no idea who wrote this. I have no idea when it was written, whom it was for, what the author wasn't able to do. Increasingly, as I became a producer of this kind of document myself for my other job, I started to have a lot more empathy for the people who were producing similar kinds of texts. Ultimately, what I settled on, or for what these documents can tell us, is they can tell us about where the frame of reference exists for the mission of any sort of public service unit. The degree to which something is elaborated on or is completely discarded can indicate to us whether that's on the periphery or at the center of how an organization kind of imagines its own functions. So, for example, a lot of the absences that we saw when it came to texts about freedom of information that I'm most interested in were about how to actually pursue redaction or severance. How do you actually decide this is policy advice, this is injurious to a public body's financial interest. Those questions are not easy to answer. For us and and when I say us, I mean like the general public. They're the essence of what we care about for freedom of information. Freedom of information never makes the news because there's some sort of new procedural update with who starts redacting the document, and whether that's changed from the records management officer, and now it's good now it's going to be this new role. Delegation of authority charts never make the news. What does is whether something was withheld or not, or disclosed or not. That's the essence of what we care about. But as we looked closer to the actual everyday practice of severing documents, we found that the essence, the things that we care about, the mission, the purpose of freedom of information, increasingly got displaced by a focus on a lot of assembly line like rhetoric. So I think like ultimately what the documents told us is that they weren't reflections or reproductions of ideas. They didn't reveal anything deep down. They were the material manifestation of those ideas. That they weren't. There's no metaphor to kind of connect the idea and the practice. It's simply the idea and the practice are one, and the document is the reality that we were looking at, which was caveated with a massive, massive disclaimer methodologically for us, which is we don't want to actually say that we can tell everything about practice, because to do that, we would have had to engage in participant observation. We would have had to speak with FOI coordinators. We would have had to do a more holistic ethnography. But we did not, at the same time, want to treat these documents as something where we could peer in too closely as outsiders and accidentally read way too far without being grounded by the realities of everyday life in the public service.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you've already kind of alluded to this, or we've said it in different ways, but I mean, this is a massive project. You examined, I don't know if you said this already, but you examined 56 public bodies and more than 36,000 pages of records. Before we get into those details, though, I mean, you alluded to this, but if you could just say, what was the single most important finding? If you could think of one thing that you want the public and decision makers to understand about this work.
Ooh, okay, yeah. I mean, I spent most of my like early days talking about, or early days, like I'm 70. I'm 22. I spent most of my early time reading literature, updating Jason Weekly and Mike on what I learned about like the sociology of discretion, and what I learned about records management on a very technical level. I had a lot of very, very exciting conversations about what is and is not an electronic documents and records management system, whether metadata application profiles the right way to go about securing metadata capture. But that stuff is really fascinating. But I think what to this day, like really, and from the feedback I've gotten from folks that have read the report, it's very late one night when I was writing the final draft, there was an issue that I had been encountering for years, something I was seeing that I had no way to describe. And it literally dawned at me at about 4 a.m. the day that I was the report was due. There was a document I was looking at from a ministry. I can't remember which ministry. And it said the purpose of this document is to comply with established standards. It's 4 a.m. I'm mostly made of iced chai at this point, and that's how I'm getting through this. And I just look at it. I remember thinking, "Oh my God, this is bullshit." And not in like necessarily in the ordinary sense, but in the sense of there's a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt who wrote on bullshit in 1986. In the early 2000s, it became like a small book republished from that essay with Princeton University Press, and was all about like the philosophical or specifically ethical communicative implications of like what it means to bullshit. His definition of it is it's communication that has no fidelity to reality. You're completely disinterested in truth. It's different from lying because someone who lies, according to Frankfurt, at least has to care about the value of truth in order to actually be successful with their utterance. Bullshitters don't actually rely on that, though. It's the act of excreting communication with no interest in whether or not it has any relationship to reality. And for me, when I looked at that document, we it just like it radiated analogies from all of these other instances where I had seen a word in a document allege that another document exists, and I would know it doesn't. So specifically, in this case, I was thinking, okay, for there to be established standards, that very, very heavily implies that there is that such standards exist in textual form. Standard is like the most particular interesting word to use for this phenomenon to exist because it literally needs to be able to standardize something across people. The way you do that in Western bureaucracies is to put it in an inscription, a document, and be able to circulate that among people. So for a document to say, "Oh yeah, we're complying with standards," that to most readers, I think a charitable reading, one that's actually really interested in taking this text seriously, would say, "Oh, okay, I assume there's a standard out there I can go look at if I'm curious." But being in this for years and looking at that public body's total release package that they provided us, there were no established standards. And then I thought to myself, okay, this is not only is this sociologically significant or philosophically significant following Frankfurt, but there's something politically undesirable about what I'm seeing. It was very, very, it reminded me almost of the way my principal talked to me as a high school student journalist, and the Vancouver School Board used to, and their officials when I was 17 and 18, is there was this sort of cling to authority that it wasn't actually necessary in this scenario. No one would have faulted the public body for not having established standards, to the same degree that we would fault them for indicating that such a standard exists and then kind of creating the illusion of authority with having no intention of actually following through on it. That whole document did something I think rather nefarious, which is to allege that a document exists and to attempt to use the idea of standardization, to attempt to use the idea of a documentary authority, and to use that in a way that I think is kind of manipulative. Even though it's on a very small scale, and I don't think this is like by any means, this is not me trying to be alarmist about it, but I think that this propensity to engage in kind of bullshit of this variety, and I don't have a name for it yet. I think I called it infelicitous intertextuality or something like that, but that's I think a linguist would not be okay with that usage on either of those words. But so I'll come up with a different name for it. But I think the idea that you're willing to commit to documentation, something that you don't really believe in, is rather dangerous for anyone who's exercising authority in the public's behalf. That is what I think is most concerning about that. What I saw for years, Jason and I had been talking about this, but and I finally stumbled upon a name at that point in time. But I think that's what stands out to me is that a lot of the documentation that I was really trying to interpret charitably, I was not looking for gotcha moments where I could point out and calculate differences between the ideal and the reality. I was just simply trying to step into the worldviews that were as honestly as I could read them. And that was what I came away with thinking is that this isn't a document that I can trust. Which is really an affront actually to the idea that was in this book about information and society is the whole reason we have documents is yes, collapsing space and time is important, but we also need to be able to trust what's in that document between people. And to see the power of that technology of documentation used that way I think about it every day. I think about it every day. So yeah, that's I think what stands out to me.
So one of the report's clearest messages is that a public body can't disclose what it cannot find. So what did the research reveal about how records are created, organized, searched for, and retrieved as part of all of this, right? We've identified that a lot of these documents don't exist and they may be bullshitting about this stuff, but what did the research reveal when you were looking at this stuff?
Yeah, on specifically records management. I mean, their archivists or the archival literature that I encountered split the kind of imagined users for records into two groups: primary and secondary users. Primary users were the creators those who were trying to create evidence of action in a record. Secondary users are, like most FOI applicants, people who are detached from the original environment in which the record was created. So I kind of immediately realized that I needed to, in order to understand FOI and understand its relationship with the Information Management Act, British Columbia's record keeping statutes. I needed to figure out I needed to figure out like how to genuinely understand records management as a field of practice. So I invested a lot of time looking in records management textbooks. I attended a lot of our records management conferences. I got a lot of fantastic feedback from professional archivists in BC. But when I wrote like you can't disclose what you can't find, I was trying to call attention to the this issue to two audiences. One, I was like the easier audience is archivists themselves and records managers, who are fantastic about putting the values of their profession up front. Every time I've had a conversation with an archivist, inevitably and very quickly, trust, democracy, truth will always come up. And I think what I admire about that profession is their willingness to put their ethics at the forefront of what they do. It reminded me about what I love about journalism, too. But I think what else I was trying to get at for the FOI audience, the FOI crowd, is that we have to care about records management for reasons that are not only about freedom of information. We have to make sure that a records management system actually serves the folks who work in the public service. If they're unable to retrieve a record in their everyday context, if they spend 10 to 20%, is a number that's often thrown around, of their working life looking for things that are in shared drives that are misclassified, that are outdated. Too many lines of business system. One line of business system is brand new and you can't retrieve anything from it. It's not subject indexed. It has no there's no metadata. That is a problem for the primary users, and the primary users are in no way able to fulfill the needs of the secondary users, FOI applicants, if their needs aren't met. So what I was trying to get at is like records, like if we want to do something about freedom of information, I'm obviously all on board with spending as much time as humanly possible talking about the definition of policy advice, how we can know it, and how we can develop ways of knowing to expedite correctly determining whether a record should be disclosed or withheld. But retrieval is just important. We cannot do any of that until we found the right documents. The government of British Columbia is increasingly describing itself as facing this a sea of FOI requests, and the requests, they love to say like complex requests. I yearn for definition of that, recognizing that actually classifying that is extremely difficult. The literature on information retrieval has studied this. I had a professor who wrote like the seminal paper in information search complexity. So I'm sympathetic, but also a bit peeved that we haven't got beyond the complex request terminology and we don't have a better idea of it. But one way to do that is actually to invest in records management, not necessarily, again, because we care about FOI, but we care about improving public service efficiency because we care about service delivery. That records management radiates benefits to all of those functions. So that's what I meant by you can't disclose what you can't find.
Yeah. Now, we've been using the language of freedom of information a lot as we've been talking about this right now, and part of the study, though, was quite deliberate about making sure that we were also considering the Information Management Act, right? Because BC has an Information Management Act and a duty to document for government decisions. Yet the report found little evidence that those obligations had reshaped every public service record keeping responsibility. Do we have any insight into sort of why this gap between the law and its implementation seems so significant?
I wish we did. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to duty to document, largely on account that it wasn't documented. Rather ironically, we asked, I think, in 2024, or early 2025, I can't remember, for copies of a document that we knew or we were led to believe existed. It's called Duty to Document Readiness Assessments. They were supposed to be conducted by all ministries in 2018 or 2019. We did not receive a single one. There was only one or two ministries of the BC Public Service that actually had any mention of duty to documents in their own, or rather, documents and government decisions is the technical term for it, as it was adopted in British Columbia via an order under the or a directive under the Information Management Act. But that statute, we found no evidence, as you said, that this has informed everyday administrative practice, which is really upsetting because I think they're like I've. As someone who's over the past 2 years become responsible for an office and setting up a shared drive and teaching people how to use it, it makes everyone's life infinitely easier when we have records management. And I've really devoted myself as a kind of peripheral member of the archival community to amplifying the importance of records managers in organizations, much in the same way that I think we shouldn't disrespect accountants for what they do to uphold the financial integrity of institutions, private and public. I sincerely believe that information professionals are severely undervalued, not only in British Columbia and across Canada. I think their expertise is deserving of statutory authority to implement interventions across public bodies, as well as to audit record keeping practices. I think that what we've seen from a decade of the Information Management Act, which largely it's about setting up the digital archives, about creating the position of the chief records officer. We haven't seen the potential of the chief records officer fulfilled, even with its fairly narrowly cast and resourced objectives now. The annual reports under the chief records officer jurisdiction are extremely trite. I was very displeased as someone who's excited about, going into government one day. And I was 18, 19 years old starting this, that there were copy pasted provisions year to year in that across those documents. They're becoming more like presentations. I think something not innocent happened when those annual reports shifted from letter to landscape orientation, and they became increasingly public relations exercises. I don't think that's just a trivial graphic design choice. I think that is indicative of an attempt, or not an attempt rather, but a devaluation of being annually accountable for record keeping to the Legislative Assembly. So for all of those reasons and all of that. I think that the Information Management Act is due for renovation. I think British Columbia, this province was a international leader in record keeping in the 1980s and 90s with the administrative records classification system and the operational records classification system. I understand there's been some work in the Ministry of Citizen Services to transform that. I think that it's literally called the Transformation Project or something very similar to that. I say we keep going. I say it's time to open up IMA and really empower archivists to be able to lead this across the province. Because again, we can talk about freedom, democracy, whether something should be secret or shouldn't be secret. If we cannot find it, like we said in the reports, there is no use having that conversation.
So who should be responsible for checking whether public bodies are compliant? Because that's a critical element here. We've long been advocating that somebody needs to be responsible. Have we got an answer to that yet?
No, I think that, part of my hesitancy to come down, like with a strong recommendation is my, wanting to give that to honestly records managers and archivists to be able to testify to and give them the freedom to define how their profession wants to be empowered. But I do think they need something, something with. I think there's a few models that are interesting in Scotland, in Australia at the state level, in New Zealand. But I'm not a researcher or a scholar of comparative archival legislation by any means. Yeah, I think I was more familiar a few years ago, but that as I honed in on some other things, that fell off my radar a little bit. So what I think I will say is that we do need someone who's independent of government, though, or at least has some guarantee of consistent resourcing, which I don't think was what we're seeing with the chief records officer right now. I'm not seeing. I don't think we've collected an audit that was actually conducted under IMA to date. There's authorities that are not being used, and I think we need to put some money behind that. As to where that goes, I'm not sold on it being the Information and Privacy Commissioner. We're already seeing a bit of portfolio adjustments for IPCs across the country with the introduction of digital safety legislation at the federal level, and some questions about the relationship between the new Digital Safety Commissioner and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. This isn't a new form of expertise. It's not something we can tack on to the IPC or to the OIPC or to an auditor general for that matter and say go figure it out. If we just do that, there's no value that I think we're just wasting money. I think that in whatever location architecturally that work takes place, it needs to be led by archivists and records managers. They're the ones who know about this very, very complex field, who have centuries of tradition associated with it, to be able to evaluate good and not good record keeping practices, to support the implementation of new technologies into the public service. Archivists have a lot of exciting ideas about how to do that. They're just simply interested in making life better for those who work there, which also happens to benefit everyone who funds that, citizens. I think I don't have a really clear view myself of where this work should take place, but I certainly know who should do it.
Well, I was going to say all power to the archivists and record managers for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Spencer, you describe severance or redaction as inherently legal work, but many of the documents you reviewed describe FOI mainly as the movement of a file through a process. And so what gets lost when legal reasoning is treated as workflow?
I think what gets lost is the fact that there's another book on my desk that describes this pretty well. It's called The Reflective Practitioner: How Professionals Think in Action. So the author, Donald Schoen, makes a distinction between technical rationality and reflection in action. And for him, technical rationality is essentially the underlying idea behind what I described as an assembly line way of thinking about FOI. It's about problem solving. And what gets lost when you only focus on problem solving, when you only focus on implementation and you don't reevaluate constantly the premises that your work is taking place, you lose the ability to actually question those premises and name the problem. You forget that part of again, the essence of freedom of information is that decision about whether to withhold or not withhold the documents. It is the essence of freedom of information is not I'm uploading this to a shared portal so the next person can do whatever they're assigned to do with it. That's not justiciable when we take it to the OIPC. The essence of freedom of information is those decisions, is owning the judgments that we make about that and being able to justify them. I think what else that gets lost, and I anticipated a question like this would come up, and the way I kind of framed what I was interested in is I looked at a lot of OIPC orders, and there's a lot that I can't appreciate about what goes into them because I'm not a lawyer. But what I did notice is they remind me almost of in elementary school, when we were being taught the scientific method, we were always taught that there needs to be like a method portion, there needs to be an introduction portion, there's your hypothesis, there's a discussion, and then a statement about your actual results, or some order like that. There's acronyms for the natural sciences like IMRAD that describe the structure of a scientific paper. There's lots and lots of literature about the internal anatomy of scientific publications, largely the natural sciences, but I think there's also some work about the quantitative social sciences to do this. Not work I'm doing because I'm an interpretive social scientist by this practice, but I saw concepts of that idea emerge in OIPC orders where you've got an introduction, a discussion, a statement about the burden of proof, some contextual background factors, then a step-by-step analysis and a recital of the different orders. All of that work is like an OIPC order is, I think, just a bit more of a slowed down and version of all of the work that we expect an FOI worker to do. And if you just imagine the differences in this work, not necessarily as like the difference between a lawyer and someone who's using FOI as an entry-level job. And you don't think of it really in terms like that, but you think about just these are moments in which we're either elaborating or compressing on judgment. Then you start to realize like, oh, there's a lot that goes into deciding whether something needs to be severed or not. And I think more than sometimes even the folks who are doing FOI work even realize. The OIPC's job is to inspect every aspect of what's in contest when it's brought before them. So they got to look back at every decision and judgment, got to review each of the records carefully, hear competing perspectives. All of that work we just expect FOI workers to do serially, and then cross their fingers and hope that nothing becomes a matter to be appealed to. So I think what's lost when we envision and we organize FOI work as a matter that can be implemented through technical rationality, is we lose the ability to develop paradigmatic examples or shared examples that can broadcast analogies of or ways of thinking about competing cases. There is a collection of some orders that are of the OIPC that are particularly instructive, that's held within information access operations in the Ministry of Citizen Services. But that's what I'm working on right now, how to characterize the inexhaustiveness of that. That's the kind of the next frontier for me. So I think that's one of the things that's lost, is the ability to actually talk about paradigmatic cases. But again, it's the ability to own judgments. And be accountable for what you're doing, to isolate oneself from undue influences. And undue influences in FOI can be, everyone's worried about political interference and whether a minister's office would interfere with an FOI request. I'm less concerned about that than I am about the FOI worker who has 10 other files that they've got going on, and they aren't structurally given permission to take the time to get it right. And their default, I worry, is to make the decision that will cause the least resistance for them within the ambit of their own job, and that might be incongruous with the needs of an applicant, which are the same as any applicant's needs, and all of our needs as FOI advocates is secrecy or not, we need to get it right. We need to get it right. Unless we have, and then FIPA, or at least myself, I don't necessarily have any quarrels with any of the concepts of the exemptions in FOIPA. I learned to appreciate the wisdom of things like the deliberative privilege or policy advice exemption that have. I believe in that personally, but I don't think we take the time to really think through what these are for. When we're not actually encouraging and giving space for FOI workers to get these decisions correct.
Yeah, I'll just ask, briefly, you kind of mentioned this already a little bit, but I mean, just succinctly, are workers really given enough guidance on the difference between information that must be withheld and information that may be withheld? Is that delineated? Is that explained? Is there discussion among them about how that's done?
Yeah, the collapse of modal verbs is, I think, what we referred to this, or what happens to this in the report. Um, No, not really. We don't find a lot of indication of in the checklists that we do encounter. There is no distinction between mandatory and discretionary exemptions. They are simply exemptions. That's really problematic because that is actually just again treating this beyond, I think, just technical rationality, but there's also some serious omission as to the complexity and the demands of the task. If there's a discretionary exemption, that is more work. That is more thinking to do, more judgment to be put in, and more effort to be put into something. And I don't mean to criticize. I'm not necessarily suggesting that anyone's being lazy. I think that the way these documents imagine the work, the way they imagine use, is in ways that are have a radical and undesirable affinity for efficiency. And they are completely discarding the fact that we need to hit the brakes and know, oh, okay, no, I actually have to make a decision. It's not acceptable. Hannah Arendt told us in Eichmann in Jerusalem to just say, I got caught up in the moment and I just went with it. I think that's actually something rather close to what Eichmann said. And I'm not suggesting by any means that there's traces of Nazification in the way we imagine FOI, but I'm making the point, I hope, that the judgment and bureaucracy have a deeply important relationship. It's never okay to appeal to a process as a justification for why a decision was made. I have felt this way, I think, largely as two influences on this idea. One being Jewish and the legacy of the Holocaust. Even before I became a student of political theory, I was interested in this idea. But I mean, also, it just reminds me of again being a journalist in secondary school and being told, "Oh, you can't file FOI requests. Why?" Oh, because I believe what I was told at the time, it impacts student learning, and we just can't have that. And I keep asking why, and there was no answer. The worst was when I think a senior official came down to my school and said, we're going to be liable for something you publish." And I kept asking for what. And at one point, I leaned forward and I said something to the effect of, "I'm going to name 5 areas of law, like defamation, privacy, copyright, etc. And I want you to indicate to me what you think you might be liable for." And I was obviously a very interesting person in high school, but what it taught me from that experience is you can't ever allow someone to make a decision without being answerable for it. And in a way, I think that's the whole point of Western philosophy. That was the first thing we read from Socrates when I was taking introductory political philosophy. But it's just kind of an elaboration of that idea: is that assembly lines are actually great technologies. Like I'm not against how wondrous it is that we can actually apply that as an analogy from manufacturing vehicles to FOI. Like there is absolutely merit to that. I'm not suggesting we all slow down everything in the sake of questioning all the time, but I do think there is merit to again displacing the focus on timeliness and taking time to contemplate on the things that an applicant actually needs, which again is the right documents delivered within the right time and severed rightly. That was the how, and we ended up referring to this as correctness, and it sounds like a very basic, like kind of has like Aristotelian characteristics to it, a little bit, and it sounds kind of obvious at the end of it, kind of misleadingly so, but we're studying a system that really does not privilege that valuation. And I don't think it's the fault of the public service too. I think that there's perhaps an affinity among FOI advocates to also be those who make calls for efficiency, which that might be an acceptable line of arguments when we're talking about healthcare administration. But if without nuance, I think that can also license some things that we don't want, which is cuts to records management work, which ultimately makes retrieval more complex or complicated, I should say, to appreciate the distinction. The underfunding of FOI workers as an area of practice in the public service, the insufficient number of them, people doing FOI off the side of their desks in smaller public bodies. With no guidance from the provincial governments about how to do that work. And I say no, there is a manual that exists, but it's an open secret that it's deeply inexhaustive. So I think that's what we lose. We lose the ability to be agile, to develop shared examples, to develop expertise, and to center the things that we care about.
Spencer, I think you've touched on a really important theme here in the report, and I just wanted to kind of get a little bit more into it. This discussion of efficiency, the emphasis on the process becoming this all-encompassing aspect of what's done, as opposed to general principles or notions of judgment. And I think one of the ways we see that in some of the documents you've identified here is this focus on timelines. Right. Focus on, the FOI request as a timeline managed thing, and with that benchmarking the timeline to the 30-day statutory limit. And so what starts off being a maximum, right? You must respond to a request within 30 days. I think that starts to become the operational norm. Did you see that, and how do you think that happens?
Absolutely. I did encounter that. That was the one kind of constant visual across all of the public bodies that did supply some sort of diagram was this very stadial sequential representation of the different steps in processing an FOI request, usually annotated with some indication of how many days each step should take. And then when you sum all of those time periods, you get a range that is you get one number, and then it extends to something that's like 30 days. I think the way that happens is two things. One, there's no actual expression outside of the statute itself that you need to move quickly. There's no indication that this is in fact an urgent matter, and it could be with applicants. As a journalist, I certainly know this, but the second thing is the type of documents that we were looking at have the effect of again, standardization. They're not all standards, guides, etc., but they all profess some sort of standardizing like effect or organizing effect. That what's represented in here is normal to all of us. It's shared as common to all of us, unless we're pointing out an exemption explicitly by saying this isn't always the case. But when you say something ordinarily takes place in 30 days and you don't qualify it at all, I think it's just very natural to interpret. It's very in keeping, I think, with a charitable interpretation of what that document means, to take away from that. Oh, this 30 days is how long every FOI request should take. That's normal. That's appropriate. It's not, it's a standard. How could it be injurious to anyone? I assume the standard was constructed in an attempt to be fair to everyone's interests in this, to manage economy, efficiency, effectiveness, etc. The whole point of having something in a document like this is that we have a typified pattern of action to achieve this contract among different values. I think that's how it happens. Is just you put that in a document. You don't really describe the conditions under which it's supposed to be interpreted. There isn't, again, already because of the assembly line way of organizing FOI work and the very, very strong bifurcation of people who know the records and people who know the law in the BC Public Service because of the centralization. You don't get anyone who is empowered to share with others that, oh, hey, the statute actually says we need to do this. It's without delay. We're supposed to move with haste. And even if the statute shouldn't be the only source of that. The democratic ethics that underwrite something like FOI also demand that you move quickly and not take an extra day unless it's necessary. And even then, we have to have a discussion as to whether or not the public body's interests are overriding and applicants. There are an ethics to all of these questions. But I think the way that it happens is, again, we have a lack of appreciation, much like that example earlier about bullshit, for the power of documentation. This is not an innocent technology. It's really powerful. There's a reason Max Weber describes bureaucracy in economy and society with reference to the management of written files. I think if I can go one step further, how this is happening. And this is perhaps where I think I have more learning to do, but my hypothesis is that the increasingly as inscription becomes more and more possible, and I'm taking this with a view of media history, looking at the printing press, looking at different ways of copying, photographing, or photocopying, making facsimiles, faxing, etc., telecommunications up and through to present. It's really easy to create a document in a collaborative environment. We literally have collaborative software for this reason. It's so easy to create a document that doesn't have a consistent graphic ideology. You've got all these little fonts. How cool! You have so much choice. You're overwhelmed with choice. Perhaps we've displaced the appropriate focus on what a document is for and what it can do. And I think the ease and possibility of just inscribing in general, among the excitement of that, last 25 years or older than more going on longer than I've been alive. Workplace computing has been popular and software like it. I think that we've perhaps lost an appreciation for documentation. It's why, when I graduate, when I leave FIPA, in quite a while still, I'm always going to retain with me the importance of making a good looking document. Not because I like graphic design, I like editorial design, I like newspaper design, but it's not innocent. It's not innocent. It has an effect on the way we interpret our obligations in any workplace. And I think that's I try and evangelize about that everywhere I go. But I think that's how that 30-day thing happens.
Yeah, I appreciate the emphasis on thoughtfulness, right? On thoughtfulness of process and thoughtfulness of judgment and interpretation, and of inscription and documentation, and that kind of connects to this notion of correctness. And if I had to say that there was one line in the report or one argument that would raise eyebrows amongst the transparency community in Canada, it would be that correctness must replace timeliness, because we've been, and I myself included, and still am, someone who says access delayed is access denied. And yet at the same time, we want to see faster responses here. I guess there's a danger, right? If people take our recommendations to heart, which I would love them to do, and there is a greater emphasis on correctness, how do we ensure that doesn't become a justification for further delay? In other words, we're taking as long as we need to get it correct, and accuracy is a focus. Is there a possibility that can actually shift things into a further state of systemic delay?
It totally can. I think anytime that you ask an authority to assume to take up to be a little bit more autonomous, define in the face of complex goals, embrace the complexity of it, and responsibly exercise discretion. I think there's always going to be a concern about interpretation, because that's fundamentally what we're really concerned about. By giving the public service even more license to define the terms of when a request is fulfilled. I think the way around that is we establish further communications between certainly the Ministry of Citizen Services and the applicant community about the way that FOI is administered. There is a serious deficit of applicant experiences outside of the realm of personal requests that's informing the way that work is conducted. I think there's a lot of focus on technology that is not going to solve the serious problems with correctness that I think we're experiencing. I think that there's a lot to be looked at there. So I think putting applicants in conversation with FOI workers and senior managers of FOI workers is how we ensure that increased discretion, that increased autonomy that FIPA is recommending be given when we're talking about a principle of correctness. I think that's how we make it accountable. And I think the principle of correctness is we need it to be answerable. There is nothing that's done in the name of a public service that can go without a justification. That is I've taken that with me in journalism, but it's from the Supreme Court of Canada in their ruling, the Vavilov administrative law case, where in the head note of the decision, Chief Justice says the public service needs to adopt a, quote, culture of justification. That the correctness doesn't exist without that. So I think that's how we make it accountable.
So Spencer, your research examined how FOI work is organized in documents rather than directly observing every workplace. So how should we distinguish between an absence of documented standards and proof that good practice is not happening?
Well, I think firstly, and I've had to become comfortable with this, is that everyone has to I think, become a little bit more comfortable with the notion that simply because it isn't on paper doesn't necessarily mean it didn't exist. But there are other consequences for something not being there. I think my answer to this is really informed by my thinking on the way. My thinking on how documenting government decisions was ineffective. Documenting government decisions, and as BC's interpretation of the duty to document, wasn't really taken up, I think, because it didn't really solve a problem for the people who were actually being asked to implement it. It was about prioritizing, like I said earlier, secondary users over primary users. It was about documenting decisions, which is not what archivists would say documentation is for. Documentation is for creating evidence of action. It's about activity. It's about creating documents not necessarily because they're in the interest of secondary users. Sometimes we explicitly create documents for that, like annual reporting, which are publishable. But unpublished internal documentation is primarily for the public service to actually effectively administer its functions on behalf of the public. I don't think that it's a matter of whether we should freak out or not because something does or does not exist in written form. As I attempted to show, something can be written down and be quite useless. It could be bullshit. We don't want to encourage that. We don't want to encourage people to just start writing stuff down for this as an end to itself. Documentation is not an end to itself. It is for something. We just have to center that a lot more. So the issue of whether something needs to exist in documentary form comes with other solutions too, questions too, like how constantly does it need to be updated? Who is going to own this document? Documentation also has good documentation has very intense labor costs. I know because I've been trying to write an introductory guide to journalism for my newspaper I've been writing these for so long and studying the construction of these documents for so long. Right after we're done, I'm going to be working on it again. I'm like 6 months in. It's not particularly long. I'm like 30 something pages in. It's a big document compared to an essay, but it takes time to produce these things. We want documents that it's themselves actually embody correctness a little bit, that are true to their original purposes and the premises for which that technology exists. So we need to think about the best ways of communicating knowledge. That might be verbal, as in the case for apprenticeships, when you're training one person. But when you've got a lot of people who are being trained at different points, when you've got a lot of people entering an organization from various backgrounds, the starting points are radically different. You need a way to establish some sort of shared collective knowledge. And I spent a lot of time, in the past year, thinking about the anthropology of learning, and studying the literature on communities of practice, as is really popular in not only educational studies but management literature too. I'm not convinced all of it resolves the issues that we're seeing with FOI, because I think because of the audience who these documents are for, there might be some promise in like the study of like scientific knowledge a little bit. So what I was saying earlier about like paradigms and shared examples, I just started reading The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn from the 1960s. Wonderful book. I knew about it before, but I hadn't read it, and I wish I read it when I was starting the study. Because I think like when we're like FOI is constantly on the move. When we're talking about creating guidance, that guidance is going to have to change. We might have to have something that teaches the reasoning behind FOI, like about FOI work, how to actually engage in the evidentiary reasoning for this particular type of work. But that's very different than inscribing like, hey, here's what the OIPC like said, like there's been an evolution in their order on like section 21, for example. That knowledge is on the move, but at a different pace than other types of knowledge. So all of those issues need to get a lot more attention. So I think if I could boil that down to just a few practitioner points, if you will. One is that you got to think about what documentation is for. That's the first thing FIPA is calling. We're not calling for performative paperwork. We're not calling for bullshit documentation. That's actually that devalues all other forms of documentation. And two, think about the lifespan of that document and how it's going to be kept current within the boundaries of the resources that are available to you. I think I have a little bit more confidence making these points now, having a little bit of occupational experience making this literature, albeit in a different domain, but also studying its production. And I think that's how we get out of the binary of do we get mad if it's not written down, and do we celebrate if it's written down but it's bad? I think we just think about the purpose of documentation.
Yeah. So there are those gaps. So where did tacit knowledge and professional judgment, was that obvious? Did you notice that? And where did that appear in these documents?
Not frequently. not frequently. I mean, tacit knowledge is obviously is embodied, but there was no indication that like this is the point where you need to rely on your tacit knowledge. This is the like there. I think there is last summer, I think I described to Mike in a meeting that I thought the tenor of some of these documents was overconfident, that they kind of overshot the runway of their own contents a little bit. That's what I was getting at. Is like tacit knowledge, again, not bad. Like we want the development of tacit knowledge. Like no one like there's a historian of science named Lorraine Daston on another podcast that I listened to a little while ago, where she said a society that runs on thin rules is not a happy society. A society that runs on as like algorithms and gives everyone explicit indication of what action to take at every step is not good. You can't accommodate all possible scenarios. You cannot actually accommodate the novel, which is yet to be theorized and typified into a pattern of action. You can't do anything with that. We need tacit knowledge. But we also need to be able to learn from it. And there was no knowledge either existed in the worldview of these documents as either embodied and you are on your own, literally, because there's no encouragement to collaborate with peers and resolve cases through conversation necessarily, or reference this document, which is highly static, despite documenting something that is on the move, albeit glacial at times, as most law is. But there is no spectrum of how knowledge evolves, and I think that's really to applicants' detriment, for sure.
Spencer, you mentioned Kuhn's work and the idea of a revolution, maybe, and I think some of the recommendations here we are calling, I think it's fair to say, for a bit of a paradigm shift in the way that access is thought about and practiced. And there are some very specific recommendations that are attached to that, right? We call for better documentation skills, stronger record-keeping statute, as you mentioned before, recognizing record-keeping as this core administrative responsibility, and also recognizing and embracing, maybe cultivating greater authority for information professionals. This is a kind of a classic chicken and egg scenario. What's the entry point for this? Which of these recommendations to kind of kickstart a paradigm shift in how we think about FOI and practice FOI? What comes first?
That's a fascinating question because I I used to, when I was starting this, I read a lot of literature on implementation studies because that was still the language that I was using to move from administration to think about implementation in the 19 in the classic studies of that in the 70s and 80s. So I spent some time thinking about that again when I was drafting the recommendations. I think record keeping is the entry point into this. I think it starts with the documentation, like with creation. Creators end on the folks that are producing documentation, not about teaching FOI specifically or regulating its administration, but I think encouraging a culture of document literacy, which includes document management, records management, is the right place to start. And if that, and again, cultural shifts in large organizations, like deeply difficult. So I think no, by no means am I trying to underestimate the difficulty of that, but record keeping most certainly I think is the entry point. I also think that's an excellent way to remind the public service that we don't have to choose between advancing the interests of the public and advancing the interests of a bureaucracy. We in this scenario they're actually mutually constitutive. Records management is beneficial to both parties in the FOI social contract over here. So I think record keeping is where I would start.
And I think that's a good observation. And that seems to be the kind of change. I mean, some of the stuff that's being recommended here for good reason was going to require some significant legislative change. It's overdue, especially since we have some statutes, the IMA, for example, which functionally just does not serve the purpose that it really ought to, or at least was rhetorically said it was going to initially. Is it possible to move forward on that record keeping without any kind of complex law reform process? Now, in other words, is that, you think that's within the power of, I suppose that would be kind of a top-down tone set from people in positions of ministerial authority to kind of launch a culture shift? Is that possible?
I think it's totally possible that we could see a lot of benefits to record keeping practice without legislative change. I mean, ultimately, a statute, as we saw with IMA, is not going to accomplish the cultural shifts that we need to see for this to be meaningful. This is absolutely something where folks who with experience in design and change management bring a lot of value to the conversation. That I think there's a lot to be, like, service designers particularly. Or routine designers for organizations. I think that even like the celebrating good instances of records management, finding some way to point to a unit or even like an individual employee who is takes the time to manage their files, that sets an example for others. I mean, this is something from my own office. I'm just kind of thinking about. I know who, because we only have 20 paid employees. Like it's a small place in the grand scheme of things. So we can, I know who pays a lot of attention to their records management and who refuses to name files correctly, and all the folks in between. And every few weeks, it's as we talk about the stories we liked and the photographs that we liked at our newspaper. I mean, one of the things that I try and do is like, okay, and I'd like to thank this person for naming a folder correctly, and then everyone laughs, and I'm like, no, it's serious. Like, this person made this available to you. Eventually, over time, the joke has worn off, and there are those that actually are really excited about the concept of organizational document management and metadata, and that's quite fun to see. So I think little things like that, even if it's just not really emerging from my research, but my own experience, taking the research, I guess, and trying to apply it to my own life. I think things like that. You don't need statutory change to accomplish a lot of the improvements in record keeping, nor will a statute change culture, as we saw with IMA.
On the flip side of that, the report also calls for independent records oversight as a function, with a greater emphasis on annual record keeping plans, more active use of standards. These are some larger changes that reflect this idea that the public record is something that there needs to be a degree of ownership and oversight over. Why is an independent oversight so important, and what would effective oversight of the public record itself look like?
I think independence is important because when we start to actually conduct evaluations or reviews of the way records management done, there are stakes involved. There are reputations, there is funding, there are policy objectives on the line. The means and the ends kind of mutually constitute themselves, as John Dewey might say, when we start to actually say whether something was good or bad. So I think that in order to give honest assessments, there needs to be some distance from core government. In the same way we have an auditor general, in the same way we have for financial and performance auditing, and we have the OIPC for information and privacy, and we have officers of the Legislative Assembly for this reason. I think that's why importance, or that's why independence is most important. Remind me of the second part of the question.
Well, I suppose it's about what independent oversight might look like, but we can just drill down on one specific element of that. I think, one of the things you expect from an ombuds office or an oversight office of some kind is the capacity to call for and indeed to effect corrective reforms, right? So, hypothetically, let's just say we have such an independent office in place, and everything that we're hoping for has come to pass, and a particular public body has just completely failed to meet minimum standards of expectations. What should happen in that kind of situation if we do have an independent oversight body? What could they do to bring them back in line, or perhaps to implement some changes?
I'm hesitant to say that the evaluator should make binding recommendations, because the second that you start to appreciate the technology, culture, policy instrumentation all need to work together, and the only people who are truly best positioned to appreciate that about the organization are the folks that work in the organization themselves. I don't think that approach will work. I do think that there has to be some answerability for it. Like, at minimum, there needs to be, I think, from the evaluator, some indication of the direction that they suggest should be taken in response to it. Failures have to be clearly identified. Recommendations can be made, but there also has to be follow-up. What I think might be advantageous is that if it's a severe failure, there are follow-ups on a monthly basis, for example, and that office is prepared to call attention to it publicly. And if a public body is seriously failing to comply, the legislature is notified via some sort of reports about the matter. But I do think that the kind of the naming and shaming, as we might crudely call it, might be the most effective way. Not necessarily be like it certainly is weaker in terms of demanding immediate action, but I anticipate it will be most effective in terms of working collaboratively towards the goals that all public bodies have, which is effectively delivering services, and records management is part of that. For whatever reason, that there are challenges to that. I don't think it's because a public body is just manifestly dedicated to being lost in a shared drive forever. I don't think anyone yearns for that when they go to work. So I don't think it faces that challenge.
So when we talk about the importance of making sure that there's an independent oversight body to look after records management, the other element that's made clear in the report, Spencer, is the whole dynamic of giving greater emphasis on archivists and records managers. So what would that look like in practical terms inside a ministry or crown corporations and public agencies to see records managers be elevated in terms of their standing within the organization? And also, if you can, one of the things that I took away from our earlier discussions on this was the whole dynamic of custodial and post-custodial errors and the impact that has created in devaluing records managers in some of these organizations. How does all that play out in the report, and what do you see as the next steps there?
Right. I think the few ways that we could recognize a more empowered archival and records management profession. One, we see that they have the resources to be able to produce guidance material. They're able to update it quite frequently. I mean, it's a easy thing in concept to do. I think we'd also see, and it's super important, is anytime that a technology of inscription is introduced into the public body, a new collaborative software system, an upgrade to such a system. We have to have archivists at the table alongside IT, privacy, security, technology licensing, etc., as a part of discussing that implementation. If it stores and creates information, fantastic. But we actually need to find a way not only to secure it from cyber attacks, not only to preserve personal information such that it's only used and disclosed to those who are authorized to do so. We also have to make sure that records can be appropriately organized and retrieved to facilitate the public body's needs. That's a really, really important absence that I've seen in the public service. The Deputy Ministers Committee on Digital and Data, the committee that makes a lot of IT, IMIT investments, as I believe the terms of reference describe it, doesn't have anyone who does the original IM, information management, which is a records manager. I think that on a similar point, a sign of a more powerful archival profession is greater precision in terminology. So right now, what we're identifying is because of post-custodial record keeping, where everyone is their own records manager, the art and the scientific aspect of what a document is versus what a record is, versus what information or data is a bit lost. We don't; those terms are not interchangeable, but they are treated as interchangeable. And I don't think that, as a student of interpretive social sciences, I think that language is really important to the way we understand our world. I don't think, it might sound like I'm just being nitpicky, but I do think, every time that you or there's a slip up in terminology and a confusion of ideas, that does contribute to something down the road that isn't productive. So we would see a lot of greater guidance on how to organize files. We would see archivists find a way to involve themselves in the orientation and onboarding of new employees such that they understand their records management obligations. We would see more regular reporting of how records management is implemented on perhaps an annual basis. It becomes something that senior executives are familiar with and are acquainted with. And then importantly, when they recognize that when an organization changes, when it restructures, when new position is created, which happens all the time in the public service, one of the folks that you need to speak with is the archivist. Yes, that involves a lot more internal consultation. Yes, that adds another box to tick. I think it is beneficial in the long run. And I sincerely hope there are public bodies that can testify to that.
Now, as we're looking at the whole dynamic right now of artificial intelligence in this space as well, what do you see as the evolving role between archivists and artificial intelligence in this space?
The one that was discussed most at a conference I attended last July was the issue of auto classification. So records that are classified on the basis of content into a predetermined classification scheme that's developed locally for the public body, still by a professional archivist. Auto classification is a technology that excited a lot of records managers at that conference. I think it's a productive use of artificial intelligence in the public sector. I don't, and I'd invite archivists obviously to push back if there are some issues with that. But there was only celebration for that idea, and the only issue was I think around the precision and accuracy of such classification available on the market at the moment. But I think that's certainly one welcome introduction of artificial intelligence for records management. Otherwise, there's still this is an area that I didn't look into quite honestly that much. But there's lots of research ongoing with it right now. There's some folks at UBC who are actually studying that. I had a professor who was also, I didn't know he studied records management, but he does. I wish I knew that when I was in his class. But he's published a few papers on AI and record keeping. I think that auto classification is certainly a valuable investment.
Well, Spencer, we have just a couple more questions before we do a final round where I'm going to ask each of you some questions and then we'll wrap this up. But I want to talk about Section 67 of FIPA. the report recommends establishing a consultative committee contemplated by Section 67 of FIPA. What does Section 67 say, and what problem would a standing open government committee solve?
Yeah, so Section 67 just says the Minister of Citizen Service, or rather the minister responsible for for FIPA, which is the Minister of Citizen Services in British Columbia, may form a consultative committee for the Act. That committee, as far as we're aware, does not exist. I feel like FIPA would be good in a good position to know if it did, but we've had no indication otherwise. So I'm comfortable saying it hasn't been formed. I think I was saying earlier that there's a deficit of applicant experiences that are informing FOI. I think that is really valuable. I think that if it was cast only about FOI, though, if we develop such a committee, that FOI would be too narrow of a space. Or of a field of vision. I really believe in this concept from an American law professor named Seth Krimer. He's called it the ecology of transparency, and he points to, we cited it in the report, he describes the success of the Freedom of Information Act in the United States in enacting some accountability for the injustices perpetuated by the United States government in the global war on terror. But he attributes those successes not only to the statute itself, but also to the people behind it, to those who are very brave to leak documents and risk prosecution, the successes in the courts, cooperation from lawmakers. There was an ecology that made open government possible. It wasn't one thing; it was many things working together as one toward a goal. So I think that an open government committee or something to that effect would be advantageous because there's a lot of issues. You'd have to do some careful designing for terms of reference to not expand into a committee on public life more generally and democracy. But we do need some sort of committee to address the issue of government information and the appropriate mechanisms for it to be released, whether that is expectations of the way that meeting minutes and agendas are made available for town or municipal councils, whether there's expectations for open data and data-based requests, which have very different needs processing-wise from text-based requests, which is largely what we think of when we think of records. We think about open data. How often is it updated? Do we have any standards about that? How do we develop new categories of records for proactive disclosure? All of that is, I think, really aligned with the mission of freedom of information. And when you consider that in a wider scope, I think you can identify some mechanisms that might be more appropriate and more efficient to achieve the same informative ends than if we were just to think about everything as accessible through FOI. So I think that an open government committee, not only would it make an FOI better, but I think when we take a step back and we remember that FOI is one of the tools in the open government toolbox, we can really do a lot of good for expanding what we think is possible transparency-wise.
Regarding this hypothetical committee, who should have a seat at the table? And I think also importantly, not only who, but like the experiences that inform the work of those that are part of this committee. What would be your ideal? What would best serve this open government committee?
Oh, and that's like the one question I didn't spend a lot of time meditating on, which is ironic because everyone calls for a committee and more consultation and then gets asked like, who should be there? The people. So this is my moment of that. I feel like the part of the answer could be found if I were to. I read recently Democracy's Second Act, just published by the University of Toronto Press. Is excellent book. It's by Peter McLeod, a journalist whose name I've unfortunately forgotten at the moment. But all about civic participation is what needs to come after voting, and all of the different ways that can come about. I think people that represent different groups, different associations that have an interest in government information are particularly pivotal. They're highly influential among different communities that have information seeking as part of what they engage in. So Journalists, Women Transforming Cities as a fascinating group. I really love the work that they're doing ahead of municipal elections in Vancouver. I think representatives of political parties, I think, honestly deserve a seat at the table. I think, obviously, I mean, journalists, I'm a bit biased, of course, but I think journalists belong there. I think folks that found FOI because they were motivated to learn more about a particular issue that really mattered to them, whether that is in Vancouver or Vanderhoof, I think also belong there. It'd be a little bit difficult, I think, to find that person, but we do have to, I think, try to make sure that as diverse of an applicant or an information seeker or someone who has a government information need out there is represented there, because I do think that it demands that holistic perspective.
And, could it examine recurring operational problems between formal and legislative reviews?
Certainly, I think that like part of what that committee should hear is updates from senior staff who are responsible for open government adjacent initiatives, or like freedom of information. I think that they have the opportunity to table concerns about the way implementation is and public policy implementation is affecting their rights, their entitlements, their needs as citizens. So absolutely, I think there needs to be no distinction between concern for statute and concern for how the statute is implemented. It's all about the subject as one thing.
Yeah, and last point on that, how would its recommendations reach the minister and the public?
It depends on obviously how you might want to research it. I can't imagine we would there again. There's that book, Democracy Second Act, probably has some insight if I went back into it about how the specific ideas get actually communicated back to the minister. I think the minister's attendance in those forums, at least on some regular basis, would be a particular benefit. That's for certain. Otherwise, I think that really depends on how you design the secretariat function of such a group. I do think it deserves it. This shouldn't just be a Zoom call where people talk and then walk away. I do think that there should be terms of reference in meeting minutes. There should be some sort of reporting expectations from the functions that are engaged. I do think that there is some obligation to consult with the committee when new legislation is being brought forward, when there are ideas that have emerged that might affect the way that a particular transparency policy is implemented. I think that there's a mutual duty on the part of someone who's a part of that committee to bring ideas, but also for the public service to bring their ideas forward as well. I don't know how to extend this to. I mean, this is all well and good for the provincial governments, but I do wonder how to define the relationship between this hypothetical committee and local and regional government, which is gets lost in a lot of discussions about freedom of information. In our study itself, we were only studying provincial level organizations, but I was on my drive to Invermere last week. I was thinking as we passed by every town and village and municipal council on our way there. How are our recommendations going to affect them? And I have less of a clear understanding of that, to be radically honest. I think that there is a movement in BC for more accountability in local government. That's come with the discussion about an auditor general for local government. The ombudsperson for British Columbia has called for a code of conduct for local governments and an integrity commissioner like Ontario has here. I support that. But I do wonder how to define the relationship between what we're concerned about and these other issues of municipal politics, which increasingly becomes a question of, because the rhetoric of the town council about how we engage in public life, which could easily become a conversation about social media if we're not careful. So the committee idea, while I believe in it, there's a much work to be done in how to make this effective.
Yeah, and I think this is all a work in progress, and I think this discussion and this larger project that we're interviewing you about is, at the very least, I hope it provokes movement in the right direction for these types of things. So, yeah, I think what you've been doing is a huge contribution, and as has been mentioned at least a couple times now, or at least once, which is that this project took 4 years and involved an unusually large and fragmented body of records. So, last question before we get to the conclusion of this, Spencer. What surprised you most about this work, and what did the evidence cause you to reconsider?
I think the thing that surprised me most was I mean, every researcher is probably surprised by their data when they're a new researcher, but I had never worked in like I said in a large organization before. My only truly I had this idea of government is like every document comes in a letterhead, is typed consistent to one typeface. It's pretty, it's deliberate, it's authoritative, it has a visual rhetoric to it, and I was not expecting to get PowerPoints and screenshots of OneNote or OneNote entries, and that be the defining bureaucratic literature of 21st century British Columbia public administration. That like the idea that when we asked for policies and that word was affected the transaction of a PowerPoint presentation in response was so enlightening and surprising, and pushed me to think about well beyond what I think Buckland was originally talking about in this book, Information and Society, which I read at the very beginning of like this the same month Jason gave me the project. I was assigned the first chapter of this for Info 100 at UBC, and I ended up reading the whole thing a few months later. But like I think that's what like the all of it, like methodologically and substantively, comes down to the way we think about the documents in politics. And I think that though I had very distant expectations for what I actually relative to what I actually got. And I feel like I'm constantly having to reevaluate the whether or not we need to go back to some sort of fictitious golden era of documentation, whether that's worth it, whether that's holding things back, how that relates to other concepts like innovation and justice. But I think like truly the variety of documentation I encountered, I was not expecting at all.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so Spencer, we are nearing the end. We're going to do a quick round of questions. I'm going to ask each of you a question. I'm going to go with you first, Spencer. Brief question here. What is the one finding, the thing that listeners should remember? What is the one finding that listeners should remember?
Make a document true to your intentions. That is the finding that I think everyone, regardless of wherever you work, wherever you are making decisions about another person, whenever you commit something to writing, make sure it reflects your intentions. That's the takeaway for me.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Jason, so what is the first practical action FIPA wants government to take from all this?
I think the first practical action we want government to take about all of this is to read and review the report and do more than just talk about it. We want them to address the current state of affairs that is really unsatisfactory right now and act proactively to move public bodies to improve their transparency, improve accountability, and restore the public trust that is constantly being eroded. Our preliminary report indicated a whole bunch of discussion guides to support those types of considerations, and there's links to all of this material on our website, in the show notes here. There's lots of ability for people to do that, but the key thing is read and review the report to start, and then do more than just talk about it by taking action to act on some of those recommendations.
Absolutely, yes. And we're going to include references and links to that in the show notes, and everyone can do the proper research that they want if they want to follow up on all the things that we've been discussing today. Mike, last question for you, sir. Why should someone who has never filed an FOI request care about this report?
It's a good question, Patrick. Well, I was reflecting on this. I think first off, you don't need to read the report to file an FOI request. That's very important. People can file FOI requests without doing so. But what's documented in the report, the challenges that are found, the recommendations, I think they're actually very close to the experiences of new requesters. The kinds of things that people who've filed their first FOI requests come to FIPA about, the challenges they encounter, are very much the kinds of challenges that are documented in the report. So we say, well, you can't disclose what you can't find. This is about retrieval. A lot of people are frustrated because they know in general that information that meets their needs exists. But it doesn't come back to them in an FOI request, and that could be because there's a lack of skill in terms of finding it, or a lack of resources, or improper archival practices, or as we've talked about, there's just a lack of documentation. So that's a core frustration of the average FOI user. Average FOI user is not someone who's going to be experienced with the metrics, right? With the timelines and deemed refusal rates and so on. They're looking for records that are meaningful to them for a variety of reasons. So I think it's a very kind of close to home report in that way, and also this notion of correctness as a standard. I mean, we have such an orientation towards quantitative benchmarking for everything, right? You got to measure it. You got to have, everyone's got bio trackers on, everyone's measuring and quantifying everything. And so the efficiency and effectiveness of government institutions and practices also becomes very much quantified. And it's about the measurements and the metrics and the graphs and the charts. But not really for the FOI user, not for the person who's looking to file their first FOI request. They just want the damn records. So the correctness emphasis there, I think, is very much in line with that lived experience of the requester. And in some ways, I would argue that a lot of the traditional literature on what's wrong with FOI systems sometimes misses out on those really core things that are pretty close to home. So that's what I would say, is that this, for people who are frustrated with the FOI process, or people who are looking to use it, the implementation of these recommendations, I think, would make a difference, a real difference.
Yeah, I think in sum, this project, this report is illuminating, helps clarify some issues that people may have. Well, I just want to say in sum here, this has been a really robust discussion, and I really want to thank all of you for your time today, and especially to you, Spencer, for 4 years of work. You did some incredible work here, and it's really a one-of-a-kind thing. So I not only feel, but I think I know that it's going to produce some very fruitful, not only discussions, but movement as well in the right direction. So Spencer, thank you so much for joining us all here today. Thank you. Access and Privacy Online reviews the headlines and delivers deeper commentary on a regular basis. Be sure to subscribe to get the full episodes every week and get notifications when we release show segments and other commentary throughout the week. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Have a good one.